Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a review of Dr. Janice Light and Dr. David McNaughton's 2014 paper. This paper is Communicative Competence for Individuals Who Require Augmentative and Alternative Communication, a new definition for a new era of communication. Okay, so let's take a look. This paper is a revision of Dr. Janice Light's original seminal paper on the 4 communicative competencies that she wrote in 1989. She later revised that paper and expanded it to her model in 2003. She wrote a book with David Buchelman, and a lot of different authors contributed to that book, and they really expanded on this model, really took it to a whole other level. This model has been a guiding framework in AAC practice since its inception in 1989. And this current paper that I'm reviewing is just taking a look and thinking, okay, 25 years later, is this still relevant? The world has changed a lot. We are in the 21st century. Technology is amazing. We have the internet. Things are a lot different. So that's really the purpose of this paper. They're just taking a look and thinking, okay, how has communication changed in the 25 years since this model was introduced? We're going to start by taking a look at the 3 constructs that really are the lens through which we look at communicative competency. The functionality of communication. What's really neat about this is that they've really embrace this biopsychosocial model where disability and functioning are viewed as outcomes of interactions between health conditions and contextual factors. They're really embedding the general ethos of the International Classification of Functioning and the participation model into their own model. The focus is really on actual communication performance within the person's naturally occurring context. Also looking at building skills that have consequences that are valued by the person. So it's really neat. It's really not that medical model that sometimes we are used to. Communication and functionality of communication, it's relative to your own goals and your own environment. Adequacy of communication. This is really about considering the communication skills that are sufficient for your environment. To attain an adequate level of communication skills, it totally depends on what your environmental demands are and what your communication goals are. We're not looking for mastery here. This is a threshold concept. It has a focus on attainment of sufficient knowledge, judgment, and skill to meet your goals and participate within your desired environments. Okay, so this last construct, sufficient knowledge, judgment, and skill, is really where we start to pull back the layers of the onion. We're looking at knowledge, judgment, and skill across 4 different domains that are intrinsic to the individual. We're going to take a look at them in more detail. They are linguistic competence, operational competence, social competence, and strategic competence. Linguistic competence is our ability to use vocabulary and grammar. It's learning how to put words together to construct meaning. For multilingual students, this means learning multiple codes. It's not just what we say, it's also what we write. This one kind of goes without saying. You need words, you need access to words to be able to say things. You need a robust language system. So if there is no morphology and syntax, you really don't have access to developing linguistic competence because you're missing all of the words that we use to create meaning. Operational competence is our ability to, control our AAC system or to use strategies and techniques. I say controlling tools, and I use quotations there because our eyes could be our tools if we were scanning and selecting with a blink. This includes aided and unaided AAC, Some examples of operational competence could be navigating to a word in a folder, clearing your display window, navigating between apps, between Google Images and between LAMP, just being able to use your tools. Social competence is about our ability to apply social rules, to behave in an expected way, to communicate in an expected way, to pick up on the nuances of communication. We must learn when not, what, where, with whom, and in what manner to communicate. This encompasses a lot of things, like beyond turn taking, it's interpersonal skills, being an active participant, maintaining and developing topics, a big piece. The last competence is strategic competence. It's our ability to use strategies to overcome restraints. Now, when we think about it, AAC utilizes tools, and when we have tools, things just tend to fall apart. There are many different types of constraints that can occur that we have to overcome. We have to learn when to ask someone to write it down for us, or if we want to increase the rate of the communication, just asking the partner to guess the word that you might be spelling on your e-tran, using an introductory strategy, noticing when the room is really loud and you need to turn up your own volume so people can hear what you're saying. Now, we're going to take a look at psychosocial factors. These are other intrinsic factors. Mistakenly, I've been calling this the fifth competency, but I've realized in reading this paper more deeply that it's just another construct, another lens with which we look at this model. So we're going to take a look at these four factors that influence our communicative competence. These are so important. They were added in the 2003 revision of this model. They weren't included in the original. So the first one is motivation. It goes without saying, motivation sometimes feels like it's everything. Without engagement, where are we? Shout out to Erna Lant. It's our desire, our internal drive to communicate. The internal drive, that is so important. We don't communicate for extrinsic reward. When motivation's waning, we might forgo communicating because it doesn't feel worth the effort, or we might not know why we would. So motivation, it's a huge piece. Attitude, so our willingness to use AAC, our attitude about ourselves as a communicator. There's a lot to unpack here around attitude. Confidence. This determines an individual's propensity to act. It's about self-assurance, our confidence in ourselves as a person, as a communicator, in our ability to try new things. And as we all know, with kids with complex communication needs, we're constantly asking them to try new things. And finally, we have resilience. Resilience is the capacity which allows a person to prevent, minimize, or overcome the damaging effects of adversity. There are different protective factors such as faith, problem-solving, self-esteem, optimism, sense of humor, and those without protective factors will have greater difficulty to rebound after adversity. So resilience is so important for us to be able to keep going. Moving on from intrinsic factors, we're going to pivot to look at some extrinsic factors. This really is based on Buchman and Miranda's participation model. So first we have environmental supports and barriers. We're zooming out and we're not looking at the person anymore. We're looking at their environment, what's helping, what's hindering. Policy and practice barriers and supports. These can really be systemic, and we can feel like we don't have a lot of control or influence over these things. Curriculum, school placements, inclusion. I wrote a big list of practice barriers that I am experiencing. But these things really influence the access and opportunity of our students. And finally, we have attitude barriers and supports. Pat Miranda says that eliminating these barriers is important to gaining membership in a community. So the elimination of these barriers or the supports of attitude, it's really about creating belonging. How is this relevant now? And I think in so many ways, it absolutely is, but the authors talk about the big changes. Demographic being one of them. The number of people using AAC has just exploded. The technology that's available has also exploded. There's just so much more choice. It's just such a different world now than it was in 1989. There's increased expectations for participation. We think about disability, or many of us think about disability differently. I think the biggest change is the way in which we communicate, the scope of communication. Because of the internet, because of texting, communication is not just face-to-face. And they really say, we for everybody, we spend so much time talking to people virtually. And this has been kind of the major shift since 1989. The second paper that I chose is from Kate Anderson, Susan Ballenden, and Sally Clendon. It's called He Cares About Me and I Care About Him: Children's Experiences of Friendships with Peers Who Use AAC. So this paper really looks at the social aspect and how it bleeds into every other aspect of communication competence and Janice Light and David McNaughton's model. It's looking at the interconnectedness of a child's friendship experiences and how this is connected to their psychosocial development, emotional and communication development. And what's so fascinating about this, and this is what they say in the paper, at the time that they wrote it in 2011, that little is known about the nature of friendships between disabled and non-disabled peers, despite this being, a big part of the goal of inclusive education. This paper focuses on the opinions and experiences of the friends, the peers of students with complex communication needs. Unfortunately, it doesn't include the opinions and thoughts of those people who actually are living with complex communication needs, but just their friends. But nonetheless, it gives us an interesting insight into the nature and motivators behind these relationships. They really talk about some of the motivation for friendship and the characteristics of the friendship. Some friendships are shaped by their understanding of disability. Others are fulfilling their own social, emotional needs. Their desire to be cared for and care for others. Others have an interest or natural curiosity in learning a new skill, that operational piece. Others are looking to be a helper, and they have altruistic motivations. And this one can, it walks a line, because there is such a distinction between helping out of empathy or being a friend and being empathetic versus pity, and taking on a helping role out of pity. And some of the kids identified this as their motivation. They were drawn to a helping role because they had pity for that student. But we know that this isn't the basis for an authentic relationship. Other students were drawn to the personal qualities of the person with complex communication needs. No different than any other peer, your sense of humor, your openness. These were all things that drew them in. One other interesting aspect was about the quality of shared time. And they talked a lot about this. And what was so interesting about this was that the students often, they engaged in these low interactive activities. watching a video together, because the physical impairments often limited the types of activities they could do. But they engaged in these shared activities, and there really was this focus on the socio-relational skills, the meaning making. And it didn't have to be, this high level of linguistic competence. We can make meaning with our nonverbals, our facial expressions, laughter, turn taking in that way. And it really seemed like this aspect really blossomed for a lot of these students. I think this paper nicely accompanies the model of communicative competence, because although it's zooming into kind of the social aspect, the social competence, it's also shedding light on how achieving communicative competence occurs through a combination of so many factors. We're really diving into social competence, but as we dive more into that, we see the interplay of all of these extrinsic and intrinsic factors as well. It's just demonstrating for us that this model from Janice Layton, David McNaughton is so multi-layered because communication is so complex and there are so many factors to consider and that influence or support the development of competence. There's a lot here. It's really challenging to keep this within 15 minutes. I felt like I could talk about this for a lot longer. So thanks for listening.